Welcome back to the fourth lesson in the Jazz Piano for Beginners series. I've already taught you about different types of chords, major, minor, diminished, and so on. However, the chords I taught you to construct sound a bit boring, and the transitions between them often sound abrupt. For example, consider a progression from C major 7 to F major 7. Now, a jazz pianist would rarely play the forms I've just shown you, which are called the root forms of the chords. They would rather use more sophisticated versions, such as maybe the following. These chords differ from the root forms in several ways. They add additional degrees beyond the seventh, which we'll talk about in a future lesson. But they also move notes within the chords around. More importantly, the chords flow smoothly into one another because the notes make very little movement. So contrast this with this abrupt jump. It's almost like a martial artist who minimizes excessive motion to execute the perfect strike. This is going to be the topic of today's lesson, which will focus on two concepts, chord voicings and voice leading. Let's start with the first, that of chord voicings. Simply put, chord voicings, or just voicing a chord as it's often colloquially called, is a rearrangement, omission, or doubling of chord notes that does not affect the chord quality itself. Now, there are three rules of chord voicings. Rule number 1, you can move any chord note you want, any number of octaves up or down. Rule number 2, you can double any note as many times as you want. Doubling simply means playing the same note any number of octaves higher or lower. And rule number 3, except for the 3rd and 7th degrees, any unmodified chord degree can be omitted. Now, these rules will become clear as we put them to good use in several examples. So let's start with the C major 7th chord in the root form. C, E, G, and B. Now I can take the lowest most note, C, and move it up an octave. So now I have E, G, B, and C. Now this is also a C major 7th chord, just voiced differently, because I'm allowed to move any note, any number of octaves up or down. Now I can keep doing this. I can take the lowest most note, E, move it up an octave, and get G, B, C, and E. I can do it again. Take G, move it up an octave, and get B, C, E, and G. And I can do it again. Take B, and move it up an octave, and here I'm back in the original form. Now all of these are different voicings of C major 7, all equally valid. Let's do another example. Again, starting from C major 7, I can take E and B and move them down an octave. And now I have this kind of nice sounding voicing of C major 7. Here's another voicing of C major 7. So E, B, C, G, C, and E. You can see I'm playing all of the chord notes, which are C, E, G, and B. I've moved them around, and I'm also doubling the C and doubling the E. Finally, here's another voicing of C major 7. Now, this simple voicing is also called a shell voicing. And to understand it, I'll remind you that you can view a 7th chord as being built on the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees of the corresponding major scale, with degrees either being altered, that is, flattened or sharpened, or not. Now, the C major scale has for its 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees the notes C, E, G, and B, so The C major 7th chord is built on these 1st, 3rd, 5th, and 7th degrees of the C major scale, unaltered. And as I've said, I can omit any unaltered note except the 3rd and the 7th. This means that I can omit the 1st, the 5th, or both of them. So, starting from this voicing, I can omit the 5th and just stay with C, E, and B. I can even go a step further and just play the 3rd and the 7th. Now, I can take this shell voicing, as I've called it, which omits the 5th here in this case, and again I can move notes around an octave. So I can take this B and maybe move it down an octave here. And this is another shell voicing of C major 7. I can take this E and move it down an octave, which is another shell voicing of C major 7. And again, take the C, move it down, and I'm back to the original form, just an octave lower. Let's do another example. Here's an A dominant 7th chord. Now this can be thought of as being built on the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and flattened 7th degrees of the A major scale. So here's the A major scale, and I can play the 1st, 3rd, 5th, and take the 7th and flatten it. And I get the A dominant 7th chord. I can omit the 5th and get a shell voicing for A dominant 7. I can also omit the 1st degree and again get the shell voicing for A dominant 7. And I can invert it, I can revoice it by taking the G, moving it down an octave. Let's do one last example, and in this case we'll take a look at E minor 7 flat 5, so it's an E half diminished chord. So the notes for this chord are E, G, B flat, and D. And you can think of it as being built on the notes of an E major scale, playing the 1st degree, flattened 3rd degree, flattened 5th, and flattened 7th. Now, in this case, I need to keep the 3rd and 7th degrees intact, and because the 5th degree is modified, it's flattened, I need to keep it as well. I can omit the 1st and remain with this shell voicing of the E minor 7 flat 5. Again, I can move notes around, so I can take this G up here and still get a shell voicing for the E half diminished. Let's talk about voice leading next. Now, I'm going to use shell voicing throughout because they're fairly simple and they sound pretty good, but the concepts I'll outline can be used with any chord. Our goal in voice leading is to come up with chord voicings that minimize jumps between notes when we transition between chords. So let's make things concrete. The ballad I've played for you in the first lesson starts with a C major 7th chord, followed by a D minor 7 and a G dominant 7th. And what I've just played are the root forms of the 3 chords: C major 7, D minor 7, G dominant 7. Now the corresponding shell voicings are, and I'm going to omit the 5th, but keep the 1st. So I have C major 7, D minor 7, G dominant 7. Now these are fairly abrupt chord changes. I'm kind of jumping around a little bit from C major 7 to D minor 7, and I'm doing a big jump going from D minor 7 to G dominant 7. Now to minimize the amount of motion, one thing I can do is I can take this F note and move it down an octave. And this brings the notes in the progression much closer together. It eliminates the big jump between D minor 7 and G dominant 7. So now we have Now, this is not the only solution to this puzzle. There are many ways to voice lead in a graceful way. Let me show you another one. Instead of starting with the form of C, E, and B for the C major 7th chord, let's start with a slightly different voicing. I'm going to move the C up here and then the E up here and start with this shell voicing for C major 7. Now, starting from this, what I can do is I can play the following. This shell voicing for C major 7, this shell voicing for D minor 7, and this shell voicing for G dominant 7. Now here's a little exercise for you. Let's say that you start from a shell voicing for C major 7, but the shell voicing you'll start with will be such that you take the C, move it up an octave. So you start from this form. How would you voice the D minor 7 and G dominant 7th chords using shell voicings to minimize the motion? Now, pause the video now and give it a try. Really do it. I mean, pause it now and try to work this out on your own. Okay, I'll show you the solution, but I really mean for you to pause this. So do it, try it, and then unpause it and see what I've done. So I can use this voicing for C major 7, and then I can use a shell voicing for D minor 7, which could look maybe like this. And then use this shell voicing for G dominant 7. So all I'm doing in these different voicings is, as I've said, moving the notes of the shell voicings around up or down octaves. Alright, now let's see how all of this is applied in a realistic scenario, and we're of course going to go back to the ballad I've played for you in the first lesson. If you've forgotten it already, then by all means go back, have a listen, and come back here so you can maybe follow along with a sort of bigger picture in mind, although you can keep on listening without it impairing in any way what you're going to see on screen. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to first play the ballad with shell voicings. After I'm done, we'll work through the first few chords together, and then I'll let you keep on going and fill in the rest. All of the voicings I've played on the left hand were shell voicings, except for the last two chords, which were the C diminished major 7 and C major 7th chord. Some of them were played in the root position, in the sense that I've taken the root position of the chord and just omitted the 5th. Some of them were revoiced, meaning I've taken some of the notes and moved them up either an octave or moved them down an octave. So maybe instead of this, playing this, or back to the root form. So let's go through the first couple of bars and see what I've done. We've already covered the first three chords for C major 7, D minor 7, and G dominant 7. I've also mentioned that this is a valid voicing, a valid shell voicing for the E half diminished. And the next voicing I used for an A dominant 7 was this. Now this is a shell voicing, taking the root form and omitting the fifth. I could have also played something like this, which would have been valid and maybe even a little better, because the motion from here to here is a little bit smaller than from here to here. But I've made my choice, which is not bad as well. The next voicing is for D minor 7, a shell voicing, taking the first, third, and seventh degrees and moving the seventh down an octave. The next shell voicing for G dominant 7 is basically what you would get if you were to play the root form, first, third, fifth, and flat and seventh, and omit the fifth. Now I'll let you work out the next four chords on your own. A minor 7, C dominant 7, F major 7, and F minor major 7. Now we come to the practice, and the idea for practicing shell voicings is something that I've hoped you've internalized by this point. As we've done in the last two lessons, the best way to practice this concept is within musical context. What you should do is you should take the ballad I've played and first of all practice the implementation I've just shown you in the key of C major. The next thing you should do is you should transpose the ballad to all 12 keys and play it using shell voicings in the left hand. Again, a little bit tiresome, but as with scales and chords, a very, very effective way to practice. The more you do it, the more naturally it will come to you. Here's an example transposing the song 3 semitones up to an E flat major. In the next lesson, we're going to start delving deeper into the fundamental theories behind jazz, and we're going to start exploring a vast world called functional harmony. This is going to give us the tools that we need to understand not how to play just chord progressions, but how chord progressions are made. Why should a certain chord follow a certain previous chord? And I hope you learned something interesting, and I'll see you next time.